Hi there, it's Llarold, and this is my class guide for Brewmaster Monk and Shadowlands Patch 9.2. Before I move on to the meat of the guide, I'll start by saying this is all based off of the Wowhead Brewmaster Monk guide, which I also wrote. So if you want a written version or maybe some extra detail that I didn't go into in this video, you could read that guide, and it is linked as the pinned comment. You could also just ask a question in the comments section. I'll be doing my best to respond to everyone who has questions. Also, it's a YouTube video, so go ahead and like and subscribe. Let's move on, and start with the main patch 9.2 changes. Unlike most of the other tank classes, Brewmasters actually did receive a couple of changes to the class in patch 9.2. The Llarold Covenant ability, Bone Dust Brew, was nerfed slightly. It deals 40% damage now on procs, but it can no longer critically strike. This would only be a buff if you're under 15% crit chance. An average monk around 252 item level is probably going to have more like 30 to 40% crit chance, so this winds up being a pretty considerable nerf. The Llarold Covenant Legendary, which was absolutely broken and horrible throughout all of patch 9.1, has been fixed in a couple of ways. It can trigger free Bone Dust Brew procs while Bone Dust Brew is active now, which has substantially increased its proc rate. And if it does proc while Bone Dust Brew is active, it simply adds its duration onto the existing buff, instead of overriding it to just be 10 seconds. Hard casting over procs will reset to 10 seconds, so that's something you have to beware of. That's actually it for the major class-specific changes, and on that note, let's just get right into the new stuff that's being added in the patch, tier sets, and second legendaries. We'll start with the Brewmaster tier set bonuses. The 2-piece bonus grants extra damage reduction from Breath of Fire. This is boring, but 4% more damage reduction is actually very good. That's worth roughly 320 versatility, and Breath of Fire uptime is usually around 75 to 80%. Not bad. Not bad at all. The 4-piece is a lot more interesting though. It adds a ton of value onto Keg Smash, and it's really just good at everything. It adds a lot of damage, it adds a steady source of self-healing, and it increases your max health by a very large amount. Best of all, it scales really well into AoE. The healing increase is shockingly strong. This may wind up being nerfed. I would expect it to be, but during raid testing, I was getting like 35 to 40% more max health from this set. It puts Brewmaster Monk on par with like Blood DKs in terms of health pools, which is very crazy. In terms of impact on your rotation, this pair of bonuses is actually kind of boring, but in a way that's really, really, really good. It's all passive. It just makes you way stronger at tanking without requiring any kind of change in your playstyle. I can't complain about that at all. I like the way Brewmaster Monk plays. I'm glad they're not screwing it up. They're just making it crazy strong. That's great. You will absolutely want to get the 4 pieces as quickly as you can, and barring any unexpected nerfs, you're going to want to wear it until the next expansion. Next up is the double legendary power. This is being time gated until week 5 of the patch, or the 3rd week that the mythic raid is open. I hate this. Basically, it works like this. When you complete the campaign quest for the 5th week of the patch, you receive a legendary belt that you can wear along with any other legendary in the game. Once you hit, I believe it's Revered with the new reputation, I believe named the Enlightened, you're able to recraft that item, its name is Unity, into any legendary slot. This new legendary grants you your Covenant's legendary power, so for classes that have good Covenant legendaries, this winds up being a huge boost in power. Kyrian is the one monk Covenant with a really underwhelming Covenant legendary power. It gives you 12 seconds of free Nuzhao when you use Weapons of Order. The value of Nuzhao comes from his stomp dealing damage equal to 25% of the stagger damage you clear with Purify, which means that you need to be taking a lot of damage for that free Nuzhao to be very good. Which it can be. I mean, it can be some of the best damage a tank is capable of dealing in this whole game. But if you use him at the same time as you use your real Nijao, only one of them will benefit from the Purifies. So you have to hold your real Nijao for at least 10 to 12 seconds on pulls, staggering it until after your free Nijao has despawned. It's annoying, and it's also a little disappointing that it adds damage, you know, under ideal and usually kind of cheesy circumstances. It can add a lot of damage, but that's basically it. The Necrolord Monk Covenant Legendary received several really important bug fixes, which has made it, you know, pretty good and really provided a big boost to Necrolord Monk's value in the coming patch. Vinthyr and Night Fae Monks also have good Covenant Legendaries, but those Covenants are still pretty weak, even with the double Legendary setup. Night Fae's Covenant Legendary is very simple. It significantly increases your Phaline Stomp reset chance and gives you a damage and healing buff on everyone you hit with Phaline Stomp. That's all really good, but Phaline Stomp is so bad that it just isn't enough to compensate. I will probably play around with Night Fae Monk, Phaline Stomp Monk during farm raids just for fun, I guess, but it's not good. Vinthyr Monk's Covenant Legendary is also simple, but again, incredibly fun. When you cast Fallen Order, you summon an extra monk, which is fine, it's just free damage. But you also gain 5 seconds of cooldown reduction every time you crit while Fallen Order is up. This was cut down to 2.5 seconds for Mistweaver only. Blizzard reported that it had been cut down to 2.5 seconds for all specs of Monk in their official patch notes, which they wrote wrong. There is a 0.75 second internal cooldown on the cooldown reduction effect, so your goal is basically to land as many hits as you possibly can in 24 seconds. I could consistently get the cooldown of Fallen Order under 90 seconds even in single target on the PTR, and in AoE I was getting under 1 minute cooldowns. The downside is that Fallen Order just isn't very strong. It deals okay damage, but mechanically it's very weak. You press a button, they come out and do damage. It's not even as complicated as Nizao. The playstyle of trying to hit as many times as you can in 24 seconds, though, was very fun to me, even though it basically just means you want to precast Rushing Jadewind, maintain it the whole time, and use Spinning Crane Kick instead of Tiger Palm whenever it comes up, and then other than that, basically you just play your rotation the exact same way. It's dumb and not that great, but I enjoyed it. It just as a change of pace for non-serious content, I found it to be pretty fun. On that note, let's move on to Covenants at large. What's the best Covenant for Brewmaster Monk? Kyrian. Necrolord has been very good in high-end Mythic Plus in Season 2, and with their Legendary providing a lot of Bone Dust Brew uptime, like in dummy testing, I basically got about 60 to 65% uptime on Bone Dust Brew, which is more than double the base uptime. I do think that Necrolord is going to see a further rise in popularity in high-end Mythic Plus in Season 3. If you're just doing, you know, timing regular 15 to 20 keys, I think Kyrian's still the go-to because Necrolord's damage is weaker than Kyrian. It may even be weaker than Vinthyr once double legendaries are factored in, but the defensive power of Bone Dust Brew is pretty nice in situations where you are constantly tanking. In Raid, you're going to be taunting bosses back and forth pretty often, and the defensive bonus of Bone Dust Brew, because it's a random proc, will probably wind up being wasted most of the time. So I think Kyrian will remain the go-to choice for raid progression. Basically keep playing Kyrian everywhere, it's very, very good. Necrolord is very tanky in Mythic Plus, and if you like it, it's totally usable in raid, but you're going to do less damage. Once progression is done, I'm going to be screwing around with Vinthyr and Night Fae Monk in Mythic Plus and in raid. It's really goofy, and I don't think it'll be a good choice for anything serious, but the Legendary for both of them is kind of fun. Now, as for which Soulbind you should run as Kyrian, it's Mechanicos. I could pretty much end there, but he adds the most damage. The defensive bonuses in his tree are actually pretty decent. Yeah, the only thing I would say I would ever change on him is I would drop Hammer of Genesis kind of down the middle of the tree there, and the third Endurance Conduit for Soul Steel Clamps, and a third Potency Conduit against pure single target bosses. As Necrolord, there's a bit of confusion at this point as to whether you should use Plague Deviser Merilith or Imini. Merilith is a much stronger Soulbind with constant mastery bonus from the top of the tree trade as long as you're flesh crafting roughly on cooldown. But the legendary procs from Bountiful Brew don't trigger Kevin Zoozling at the bottom of Merilith's tree. They do trigger Lead by Example at the top of Imini's tree. Both Soulbind passives have the exact same wording. They just say Bone Death's Brew causes the effect to happen. The weaker one in Imini's tree will happen a lot more than the stronger one in Merilith's tree, and I don't know. I still think Merilith is stronger, but maybe Imini catches up as Season 3 progresses. We're still figuring it out. The Naya Soulbind is the only reason you would ever consider playing Night Fae Monk. Her top of the tree trait, Grove Invigoration, grants 1% health and 25 mastery for every stack. You generate 4 stacks every time you cast Phaline Stomp with an extra 2 procs per minute on top. Stacks last 30 seconds, but they don't refresh the duration, they just stack up and fall off on top of each other. With good RNG in the Covenant Legendary, you can maintain 15 to 20 stacks pretty easily. 15 to 20% extra health and 400 to 500 mastery is really great, but again, still, this is bad. General Draven is the tankiest Soulbind for Venthyr. Theotar the Mad Duke can offer a little more damage, but his bonuses are all RNG procs, and that makes him pretty unreliable. Again, Venthyr Brewmaster Monk isn't very good, so I don't really think it matters, but Draven's the tankiest, blah blah blah. Now let's quickly cover Conduits, which fit into the empty sockets in the Soulbind trees. The good potency Conduits for Brewmaster Monk are Walk with the Ox, your Covenant Conduit, Scalding Brew, and lastly, Adaptive Armor Fragment. At most, you can only run 3, but for most of the good trees, you're only getting 2. Walk with the Ox is very good. It buffs your Nuzao damage a lot and cuts his cooldown substantially. The cooldown reduction procs from every tick of Spinning Crane Kick, so using Spinning Crane Kick in single target instead of Tiger Palm is a DPS increase if it means you can get more Nuzao casts off during a fight. The Covenant Conduits are all pretty simple but pretty good. Scalding Brew, because of the new 4-piece tier set bonus, has been indirectly buffed. It was the weakest of the bonuses, and it still is prior to getting the 4-piece bonus, but at that point it actually receives a pretty sizable boost in both offensive and defensive value. The fact that it requires Breath of Fire be on the target for you to get the Keg Smash damage increase is a bit of optimization that means really high level players can sort of game around pooling Keg Smashes to then layer them in once you have Breath of Fire on. But, you know, it's a little inconsistent and it's a lot of extra work for a pretty minor boost. Adaptive Armor Fragment is very simple and boring. Whatever, it's just, you know, free agility for being healed. Endurance Conduits are also pretty simple. You have 2 decent options, the rest are pretty bad. Harm Denial grants you extra self-healing with Expel Harm. It doesn't affect the healing you get from Gift of the Ox Orbs consumed with Expel Harm, so it's not all that big of a bonus, but it is still the best, most consistent self-healing increase available. I would recommend it as your number 1 Endurance Conduit choice. Condensed Animosphere is the other good power. It just adds a steady trickle of healing, 1 proc every 10 seconds, it's pretty boring. Celestial Effervescence might look good. It increases your self-healing while Celestial Brew is up, but that only applies to the base heal of Expel Harm, just like Harm Denial, and Vivify. You probably aren't going to hardcast Vivify while Celestial Brew is up, so this trait actually winds up being really bad. For situations where I have 3 Endurance Conduits in front of me, I like Grounding Breath just for the Vivify healing in case I need to quickly roll out of melee range and heal myself up in a Mythic Plus, or to heal in between pulls or during transitions, or maybe I'm running the Vivify spam build in Torghast. The Energy Refund has a 1-minute internal cooldown, so it's fairly minor. The other 2 conduits don't matter at all. And finally, Finesse Conduits. Dizzying Tumble grants a minor damage reduction effect after your leg sweep fades from enemies. It's a small bonus in Mythic Plus, but it's okay. I typically prefer Swift Transference now for the minor movement speed boost after using Transcendence. Neither power is very strong, and other Finesse Conduits are even less important. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and I'll say there are only 2 pieces worth discussing now. I will need to start by saying that tier set pieces force you not to wear Legendaries in the head, shoulder, chest, gloves, and leg slots. You could wear a Legendary in one of those slots, but then you're banking on getting 4 pieces of tier across the 4 other slots, which is a gamble I don't want to make. First off, it's Storm Stout's Last Keg. This has been my favorite Legendary throughout the whole expansion. In patch 9.1, I recommended crafting it in the belt slot, and I still do, but the new Legendary that you get from the campaign is initially given to you as a belt. Now, that's a whole complicated thing. It's not really that complicated. You get to Revered with the Enlightened, then you recraft it to a ring. That's my recommendation. You could also craft Storm Stout's Last Keg to gloves or shoulders, but I would rather just simply run Storm Stout's Last Keg as a belt, new ring in the, or whatever, Unity in the ring slot. There you go. If you can't afford to recraft Unity yet, or you haven't quite farmed up the rep, I would say, well, go farm rep, but make Storm Stout's Last Keg as gloves until you can get that sorted out. Okay, Storm Stout's Last Keg as the default Brewmaster Legendary. It's a solid DPS increase, it's a solid defensive increase, it greatly improves the value of haste by eliminating the 14 and 33% haste keg smash cooldown breakpoints. It's simple, it's great, and best of all, it synergizes really well with the 4-piece tier set bonus. The only other option worth discussing is Charred Passions. You should craft this Legendary in the cloak slot. It's the top DPS choice for raids, although the gap between it and Storm Stout's Last Keg has grown a lot closer thanks to the new 4-piece bonus. I haven't really been a big fan of Charred Passions throughout this expansion, and I think it is technically getting worse, but it's not bad. It also will give you 100% uptime on Breath of Fire, which is great for the new 2-piece, but it's just not quite as fun or interesting as Storm Stout's Last Keg. Best option for single target DPS by a tiny margin. As soon as you get into any sort of AoE, it's worse than Storm Stout's Last Keg. It's also a lot less forgiving defensively. Okay, let's move on to talents. This is the default talent setup. You'll want to use this 90% of the time. There are a couple of talent swaps you can make if you prefer. Chi Burst is really useful if you're playing Night Fae. For some reason, every enemy and ally you hit with Chi Burst counts as a separate spell cast for the purposes of resetting Phalanx Stomp. So quickly going Phalanx Stomp, Chi Burst, Phalanx Stomp is usually pretty doable. It's almost always a guaranteed reset in raid. Otherwise, I recommend running Chi Wave at all times. You deal more damage and healing with Chi Wave than you will with Eye of the Tiger, and it helps fill gaps in the rotation. You can use Eye of the Tiger if you like, but I think it's, boring. It's passive. You can also switch to Chi Torpedo if you want the bigger bursts of movement. I prefer the greater degree of control I get out of Tiger's Lust, especially when there's any situation where I might be slowed, and then be able to remove that with Tiger's Lust. Switching to Summon Black Ox Statue to pick up adds can be really useful on some raid fights like Artifice or Zymox off the top of my head, but Ring of Peace is usually my preferred choice, and I might still use it on Zymox so that I can ping those annoying ads all over the place and try to help group them together. Bob and Weave is a really good talent in Mythic Plus. It's simple and always good. I usually prefer Dampen Harm because I like having an extra cooldown for hard-hitting enemies, or whenever I make like a larger than normal pull in Mythic Plus. But Bob and Weave is also extremely popular in dungeons. In raids, I would always use Dampen. I think the extra cooldown is much more useful in raids. Special Delivery is actually a higher DPS choice than Rushing Jadewind if you make large pulls in Mythic Plus. The longer, powerful slow is really helpful for kiting as well. To be honest, I don't really enjoy the playstyle of giving up Rushing Jadewind. I like having it as filler in Mythic Plus, but Special Delivery is a good talent option. Again, just for Mythic Plus though. In raids, it's always Rushing Jadewind. And that's it. Light Brewing and High Tolerance, they are one talent rows. That's it. You never change them. Brewmasters have 2 very different rotations based on which of the 2 legendaries you're wearing. This is the standard rotation, which you'll want to use if you're wearing Storm Stout's Last Keg, If you don't have a legendary yet, let's say you're still leveling or you're on a character that just hit 60 within the last 10 minutes, you don't actually need to change much at all. It's ultimately simpler than what's even written here. Basically, you just keg smash on cooldown and then use everything else the same. Generally, you're going to start off pulls by running in with Rushing Jadewind active, then you'll pop Nuzao, keg smash once, use Weapons of Order, keg smash 2 more times, and so on. Just do your regular rotation from there. Also remember to Touch of Death whenever it's usable. The only little note I would make here is that if you're Kyrian and using the Kyrian Covenant Legendary, be sure to wait 12 seconds after using Weapons of Order before casting Invoke Nuzao. You don't want your 2 Ox buddies to fight for all of your purified stagger value. There are points where quickly using Keg Smash twice in a row can be worth doing. Say you're trying to pick up threat at the start of a tough pull in Mythic Plus, or you're trying to quickly burst down some ads in a raid fight that has ads that need to die really quickly. Otherwise, you're basically always just trying to keep at least 1 Keg Smash on cooldown. Use all your other skills that are important and have cooldowns, you know, Blackout Kick, Rushing Jadewind, that Expel Harm, and then Keg Smash when you don't have anything else left of value to use. In terms of defensive skills, the way you Purifying Brew is very simple. Use it a lot. If there is a telegraphed boss hit coming up very soon, you probably should hold Purifying Brew to be able to purify immediately afterwards, but otherwise try to use it very frequently. As for Celestial Brew, it's kind of the same thing. There are situations in which you really do need to hold on to it to counter some sort of big boss mechanic, so be ready to do that as needed. That tends to be more of a raid thing than a Mythic Plus thing. In Mythic Plus, it tends to be more of a free-for-all. If your health drops low, chug Celestial Brew and shield yourself, then start working to get it back off of cooldown. Alright, I think that Charred Passions really deserves its own special section in the video, so let's just go over the playstyle for that now. It's very, very different and completely DPS oriented. Again, I'm reiterating this. This is not a defensive playstyle. You shouldn't play like this for anything you're worried about being killed on. Because Breath of Fire and Chi Wave have 15-second cooldowns and Charred Passions is an 8-second buff, having both of those creates sort of a burst window playstyle. It works like this. If Charred Passions is active, you still want to Keg Smash on cooldown. Otherwise, you want to maximize your usage of Blackout Kick and Spinning Crane Kick above everything else. Maintaining Rushing Jadewind is still important, but you want to refresh it going into the Charred Passions. You know, basically Rushing Jadewind, Breath of Fire, then Charred Passions window. If you were to refresh Rushing Jadewind instead of using buff Sprinting Crane Kick, that's generally a DPS loss. The same goes for using Chi Wave while Charred Passions is active. This also goes for Celestial Brew, which is why this is such an offensively oriented playstyle. You should try to pool as much energy as you can during the points where Charred Passions is down by refreshing Rushing Jadewind using Chi Wave, so that you can maximize your Spinning Crane Kick usage while Charred Passions is active. That means using Celestial Brew as a throwaway defensive filler when the buff is down is kind of a good idea. Yeah. Finally, you'll notice that Tiger Palm isn't even listed here, and that's because it's basically worthless except as a defensive skill, and this is a totally offensive playstyle. You can use it if you really need the brew cooldown, but if you do, you probably should just be playing the Keg Smash setup. For the start of pulls, you will again want to precast Rushing Jadewind before the pull, pop Chi Wave as you move into melee range, then Keg Smash, Weapons of Order, Keg Smash, Blackout Kick, Breath of Fire, and go from there. Again, if you're Kyrian, and you probably should be if you're trying to maximize your DPS, which is the whole point of this, and you're using the Covenant Legendary, you want to be sure that you're not overlapping the free Nuzao that you get from Weapons of Order with a real Invoke Nuzao the Black Ox, because you would just be wasting their damage output. You definitely want to be really, really sure that you're staggering those two out and maximizing the amount of damage that you're able to purify while each of them is active. Alright, now let's move on to stats. The basic stat priority for Brewmaster Monk is still pretty much the same as always. Versatility and Critical Strike are the most important stats. You want as much of them as you can get. Mastery is okay, but it's less consistent, and haste value really fluctuates with the rest of your gear. Haste is actually decent despite the community kind of having developed this conception that it's terrible because it was a literally worthless stat for a long period of time in Legion, but it's still a step below both versatility and crit. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are tier set bonuses, double legendary, sockets and item level. Getting as much versatility and crit as you can is good, but secondary stats aren't that huge of a deal. The difference between absolute best case and worst case just isn't really that important. Certainly not if you're comparing a well-itemized low-level piece of gear and a poorly itemized high-level piece of gear, where the higher item level one that's got a bunch of haste on it. One important note here, though, that I will say is worth giving up item level is dual wielding. It's generally always worth doing. You really only need one good one-hander for dual wielding to be better than using a two-hander, as the damage of being able to put lightless force onto each weapon is very good, and the secondary stat budget on all weapons is pretty small. I've been gearing up a second monk lately, and I've found through sims and experience playing an undergeared character, as well as simming, raid drops that come from Sepulchre on my current character, two-handed weapons really underperform compared to dual wielding. To put it into perspective, you need a two-hander to be about a 20 to 25 item level upgrade over the one-handers it's replacing for it to actually be an upgrade. So that's the one spot where I would say give up some item level. If you're wearing some, like heroic raid weapons and a mythic two-hander drops, sim it to be sure, but probably stick with dual wielding even though it's lower item level. As far as trinkets go, there are some decent ones from Dungeons and Raid, and I'll just highlight the best options. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a simple single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus. It's totally passive, but very nice. The best defensive trinket from Mythic Plus is Blood Spattered Scale, which is from the other side. It's an excellent defensive trinket that still offers a decent chunk of damage output. Both of those two trinkets were recently nerfed. This is an attempt to make other trinket options from Mythic Plus more desirable to more players. Was anything else buffed? No. It all still sucks. Codex of the First Technique from Tazavesh is actually pretty good, and it is something I think a lot of players will be farming now that Tazavesh is being added to the Mythic Plus dungeon pool in Season 3. The stamina is not great, but the damage reflection effect is very good for raid fights where you're constantly tanking, especially like a bunch of little adds, or obviously Mythic Plus. There are two new trinkets from Sepulchre, the first ones that seem just okay right now. The rest are fairly generic. There is one I will point out for being awful. But let's get to the okay ones. Pulsating Rift Shard is an active defense trinket. It takes 3 seconds to go off and has a 1-minute cooldown. It's kind of like a Blood Spattered Scale at first glance, but the 3-second windup and the extremely thin line make it pretty uncomfortable to use. On a training dummy, it's a pretty good defensive trinket, but in practice, I have some concerns. That being said, the 1-minute cooldown is so short that I think this will wind up being a decent option. They rebalanced this trinket while I was working on this video. They cut the cooldown from 3 minutes to 1 and the windup from 4 seconds to 3. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more changes happen as people get this and start complaining about how awkward it is. And between the time I wrote that and actually got on the microphone to record this, they changed it again. It now splits the damage it deals, so the damage output sucks. This trinket is okay as a shield. I think the trinket's gonna be kind of trash as it is right now, but I would say be ready for even more changes. It might wind up having the whole countdown to the shield be either reduced more or removed or whatever. It could wind up being amazing by the time this, by the time the raid's out. But as of right now, when I'm talking about it and having just tested it, I don't like it, but it's okay. Pocket Protoforge is really simple. It's just a proc shield trinket. It's boring. It's okay. 1 proc per minute is a little underwhelming, but it's alright. I will finally mention that Elegy of Eternals was giving over 1,000 secondary stat budget on 100% uptime, and now they've nerfed that trinket to be at, I think at 287, 288 item level. It's now weaker than the Castle Nathria trinket from Mythic Stone Legion Generals. It's like 100 versatility. Very bad. It is free versatility though, so I guess that's something, but no. Okay, let's quickly go over a couple of trinkets from Sanctum of Domination that I think will actually still be good next tier, at least for a little while. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 is really, really strong defensively. It reduces a flat amount of damage from all hits and all dot effects while it's active. The reason that it's good is that calculation is done after all damage reduction effects are calculated, including stagger. The only way this doesn't keep from being used during farm and into late Mythic Plus, late season Mythic Plus of Season 3 is if it gets nerfed, which I expect they will try to do by cutting the absorb value down. For all the non-monk tanks, I think that would actually work, but for monk, because it's calculated post-stagger, but also affects stagger ticks, I think even a nerfed version of this trinket would still be terrific. Now, if they nerf it by like 90% or 75% or something, then maybe not. But if they increase the cooldown by a couple of minutes, I think that would actually kill it. I just don't think anybody making gear and making this kind of decision at Blizzard is clever enough to realize that. So if there is a 25 to 50% nerf to this trinket, I actually still think it's great for Monk, but sucks for everybody else. Weave of Warped Fates has been redesigned to be just a normal cheat death trinket now. Unlike the Splintered Heart of Ilar from Castle Nathria, it doesn't really do anything except prevent your death. No damage to nearby enemies or allies, and the item level is a full raid tier higher. That's good. Now I won't kill my holy pallies when I cheat death. It will probably be a go-to trinket for high-level Mythic Plus for the rest of the expansion, to the point that people who really want to be serious about Mythic Plus are probably going to have to go back and kill Mythic Fate Scribe. It should be a must-have for progression and Sepulchre of the first ones unless they do some last-second, unexpected, just destructive nerf to it. But I doubt it. I think it's just going to be a really, really good must-have, top 2 trinket for the rest of the expansion. Cool. As we're heading into the final patch of Shadowlands, I think things are looking really good. The new content looks fun. The new bonuses are powerful. Brewmasters were great in raids last tier, and I think they're going to be great again in both raids and Mythic Plus in the upcoming patch, thanks to their awesome new tier set bonuses. I'm really looking forward to it. Well, I think that covers it. If you have any questions about Brewmaster Monks at Shadowlands Patch 9.2, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye!